Hello and welcome to News Club UK, a weekly panel show that doesn't just talk about the same old, same old. I'm your host, Thomas Barlow, Chair of the Media Fund, and this week we are joined by Ian Hodson, who's the National President of BFAWU, the union responsible for McStrike and the Spoon Strike, elected by the membership on 3 occasions in 2010. That's what he made sure I put in the bio. We've got John Bosco Noble, who works as a campaigns officer at Public Ownership Campaigns Group. We own it. And yes, I did absolutely massacre his name. You can find it in the description along with his Twitter profile. And finally, Natasha Josette, who is a communications professional and organizer for the Political Education Project. Hello, guys. Thanks for joining us. You all good?
Yeah.
Good. Yeah.
Yes.
Well, I know you're good. They've all been ripping the out me prior to this, so thanks very much for the confidence boost, guys. But we're going to be we picked some big topics this week. I mean, huge ones, and it's been a big week for news. So I'm really excited to get into it. We're going to be talking about the biggest strike in human history in India, India's big strike wave. We're going to be talking about Black Lives Matter, Millwall, and Marxism. And we're going to be talking about blocking Brexit deals, or are we? So we've got all of those on the way soon. But we're going to be starting with Natasha Josette, and we're going to be talking about the biggest strike in human history. So let me introduce this topic for you before I bring Natasha back in. We're taking from an article by Jacobin, which is titled, "This is a Revolution, Sir." And it's about the largest strike in human history. Workers in India last week launched a general strike that brought out an estimated 250 million people, arguably the largest in human history. Now they're joining hands with farmers to protest Narendra Modi's pro-corporate far-right agenda. General strikes in the era of Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi have an oddly repetitive quality to them. First, the major national level trade unions, save for the one aligned with Modi's far-right Bharatiya Janata Party, BJP, call for 1 or 2 day general strike, usually in response to the BJP's latest raft of anti-worker policies. Millions of people across the country pour into the streets in support. Strike leaders tout the action as perhaps the largest strike in history. Left media outside of the country hailed the walkout, while mainstream media in India barely mentions it. And then life seemingly returns to normal. But back in March, the government used the pandemic as an excuse to crack down on and clear the last physical remnants of widespread protests against its discriminatory citizenship laws. And so the sight of people out on the streets in protest was a striking display this time around. Even more importantly, the general strike converged with a march launched by a broad group of farmers' organizations, all planning to descend on the capital of Delhi. Social media was suddenly awash with images of farmers using tractors and trucks to break down the barriers erected by police to keep them out of the city. In one video, a protester emphatically explained to a policeman at the barricades that this is a revolution, sir. So let's bring in Natasha and let's ask some questions about this, because I'm intrigued. I'm very intrigued. And whilst I'm going to continue to try and ask awkward questions, I'm going to have to ask just some dumb questions, because I wouldn't have heard of this if it hadn't really been for you bringing it up and left media. So what is going on here and why is it so important?
Well, I'm going to say that I brought this up not because I'm an expert in Indian politics at all, but mostly because we haven't heard about it and it hasn't really been made much of a story in our media here at all. And that made me kind of question why. And so like the more I looked into it, the more kind of like, I mean, it's 250 million people going on strike is really quite astounding, right? I mean, that is a lot of people and arguably the largest in human history. A strike led by farmers, as well as 10 of India's labour federations who all took part. So we have like a joint labour union statement that reports of successful strikes in the mining industry, employees of postal, telecom, steel sectors, all going in solidarity actions on the same day. I saw this article from a NewsClick. It's an Indian kind of progressive news site that said the strike saw stoppage of work in banks, financial services, various government services, transport, steel unions, port and docks, telecommunications, plantations, power generating units, coal and mine, oil, gas production. Like, there were unemployed workers, women from like thousands of women workers, healthcare workers, all in solidarity actions. I mean, like, it's just astounding that the kind of level of solidarity, and 250 million people. And it just, like, we hardly heard about it here. And it just made me really want to question and bring this to News Club, because, like, why is this not being on the headlines?
Yeah, I mean, it seems to me if like we got 250 million people to do anything together, like, I don't know, jump up and down once or something, it would make global news. Like,
I mean, the earth would shake.
yeah, probably everyone would fall through, right? Like, I mean, that's what would happen, science. But you know, it seems like if 250 million people did something very trivial together, it would make global news and everyone would talking about it. But because people are doing something very serious, but something that also challenges, you know, both the government, but also like the power of big business, really. And these strikes sort of seem to be against sort of big business as much as the government.
Well, it's definitely like corporate interests who are calling the shots, and workers getting crushed under the pressure, and all during a global pandemic. And in that context, you have people, solidarity movements, as well as the labor movement and farmers, all coming out in strike against a right-wing government. And no one is talking about it, which makes me kind of think, well, why do they not want us to know that there are movements around the world who are rising up?
Now, it might be that we're talking just a lot about COVID at the moment. We've got Brexit on. Obviously, some stuff happened at football club. We're going to be talking about those things. Mm-hmm. And there's a piece on the BBC website and stuff like that. So do you think this is just a normal case of the British media going, if it's not happening here or the US, we're not really interested? Because that seems to be the way that the media has gone in the past decade, especially. Or is there something more about what it is that the strike is doing?
Well, it's definitely more, because like, it's quite challenging when you've got Joint Labour Federation who are asking for demands that include like minimum income, food for poor families, guaranteed number of work days, higher wages, pensions for everyone, and end of forced retirements. I mean, like, they're calling for the government to stop privatizations, as well as addressing the anti-farmer laws and anti-worker labour codes. And you have that in the context of the rise of the far right all around the globe. And I mean, maybe unsurprisingly, 250 million people on strike barely made the headlines here. I mean, I was scrolling through my Twitter feed this morning when I was thinking about coming on this afternoon, and I saw that a Labour MP for Slough, Tandese, brought these protests and violence used against the protesters by Modi's government forces to PM Johnson, and asked if he believed in the fundamental human right to be allowed for people to be allowed to protest peacefully. And like, the look on Tan's face when Johnson replied really said it all. I mean, he was just absolutely horrified, because Johnson stood up and said, "We have serious concerns about what is happening between India and Pakistan. And these matters are between the two governments to settle." Which is like, huh?
Wow, I had missed that. I hadn't been. Again, we've had a Brexit day in PMQ, so I hadn't noticed that he had conflated an internal.
I mean, just like, and you just say, so my instinctive response, apart from just to kind of be horrified, was also like, was this yet another sign of Johnson's ignorance mixed with, you know, arrogance, not paying attention to the question, that he was disinterested in other parts of the world, as we'd expect from like Johnson's casual blundering through his leadership? But I just kind of feel that also, I mean, that's partly true, but I also kind of feel like there's almost something a little bit deeper going on, where we have this kind of axis of far right growing from Bolsonaro, Trump, Modi regimes around the world. And we also have a rise of movements who are organizing against them. And where like capitalism is failing, people rising together with alternatives, and these movements around the world are met with extreme state violence and brutality. And the establishment, specifically here, the establishment media, playing a part in downplaying or misinterpreting, misrepresenting the uprisings, you know, not reporting student protests, not reporting the murders of climate justice campaigners. I mean, look at the, you know, I got in the post this morning, my this month's Red Pepper, and like the first few pages, we've got photographs from Thailand, Indonesia, Mexico, Belarus, all these kind of protests around the globe. And that's just this year alone. And the establishment aren't going to feed us the news that would inspire us to organise change against them.
Yeah.
So it's like, it's easy to laugh off Johnson's blundering and his funny hair and his ziplining, flag waving personality, rather than question what is really going on and why they don't want us to transform it.
Yeah, and Johnson uses that appearance of being stupid and blundering, you know, to not answer questions directly. Like, that's a technique, right? You know, that's not a mistake. He you know, that's a like, you know, people have regularly reported that he ruffles his hair before getting out of a taxi, and he makes sure that he looks as disheveled as possible. It's a facade, it's an act. So, and we've seen that, like, again, I can't be bothered mostly. That I find most politics in Parliament performative. But if you do bother to watch Prime Minister's Questions Times or anything where he's asked a question, he doesn't answer a single question, like not one. And he doesn't even include a kernel of a reference to the question in his answer. He'll talk about something completely different. And it's done in a way so as you could laugh it off as if he was stupid. But you can't be so stupid as to never answer a question. That has to be a either unconscious, but probably very conscious, you know, methodology to deal with difficult questions and to divert us. Now, talking about diverting us, there doesn't seem to be genuinely a discussion about what challenges unions and workers are going to be facing this winter and in the new year, because those things are going to be occurring. As you say, we don't report on global strike conditions. And I thought, is there going to be anything that drives people here to strike? Are we going to see similar types of actions, or are we certainly going to at least be challenged in the way that we see in, say, India and all over the world?
Well, I mean, this winter and definitely into the new year, we're going to see workers impacted by job losses, right? And alongside this, we've got benefit cuts, low wages, inadequate sick pay during a pandemic, rise in child poverty. Like, the challenges go way beyond the workplace. And I think this is where we can actually really take time to learn from the global movements, and certainly like worker-led movements in the global south, like, for instance, the strike in India, where we're talking about actions by unions that are all joined up with like broader social movements from students, climate justice, Black Lives Matter, coming together to rise up against economic and political injustice. Like, that is possible. And we've got examples throughout history and throughout the world right now that are doing it. And, you know, we have to kind of really see that this pandemic and the government response bring to the surface existing inequalities. You know, we need to organise and be politically educated working class movement in all our diversity that is rooted in our communities to counter the political and the media establishment at every level. And like, we can't not do it.
Yeah, well, hopefully News Club is part of that. And also, let's quick shout out to Opus Independence and Now Then, who support this channel and the Media Fund. Please check them out. Links are in the description, or just Google them, or use a different search engine. Ecosia, they plant trees for every search you make. And I'm going to bring everyone in after these questions, this sort of last question, which is there anything outside of trade unions and the union movement in the UK that can give us hope? And what kind of things can people, you've talked broadly about, like, okay, we can have unions that should be allied with movements in the community. Are there anything specific that you think people can start working on to help tackle these coming winter crises that we're going to see with flooding as well, and potentially, you know, trade problems and potentially food shortages?
Are you asking, is there hope?
Is there hope? Is there hope, and can we do something?
Is there hope? I'm an organizer. There's always hope. I mean, like, before looking at the UK, I think it's kind of just want to stay out, like a bit more international, and kind of draw from other parts of the world for inspiration. So we've looked at India, but this year we also had, for example, in Chile, where 78% of people voted to rewrite their constitution that had been in place since a right-wing government in Pinochet in the 80s. And this wasn't just a win for parliamentary democracy, which you've already said you're not that keen on. This was
performance, you know? Performance.
Performative. This wasn't performative. This was a win for people after years of civil unrest, and they have organized and mobilized against a right-wing repressive government and faced daily violence, and they won. And I think like having those kind of that hope and inspiration from around the world, we can actually kind of then look at how we organize here and draw from their experiences and offer our solidarity to them at the same time. I mean, one of the easiest thing that kind of was quite inspiring at the beginning of lockdown was how the mutual aid groups just kind of completely took off, and working class people really stepped up for one another when the government didn't. And those are opportunities to continue our political education and continue being politicized. And then there are, you know, other amazing things kind of kicking off in the last few months, like student rent strikes that started in Manchester and now kind of snowballed through Cambridge and Bristol unis. And before that, we've got the young climate strikers, or global climate strikers, who are asking for a global Green New Deal, where they are like the next generation of leaders who are coming up and who are talking about putting anti-racism and anti-capitalism into the climate justice movement. And that's kind of really big and really hopeful, because we can't avert the climate crisis without dealing with those two things and making them central to our organizing. So yeah, there is hope. We get organized, we self-educate.
Self-education, they can get involved with the political education project that you're part of.
You can, of course. Good plug, like it.
There we go. So, okay, I just wanted to see if Ian and John Bosco here had any questions for you or any considerations. And I'll start off with John Bosco. You know, do you take inspiration from what's happened in India, and are there any lessons you think we could learn? Oh, yeah.
Yeah, well, I'm from, I may have mentioned this before, I'm from Nigeria. And for the first time in a long time in Nigeria, we recently had protests against police brutality. And I suppose I could draw some parallels between what happened in Nigeria recently and what's happening in India right now. But I'm also always quite dubious about things as they happen, where they happen, and the way they are presented in the Western press, and not just from the point of view of whether or not those things are presented unfairly, in terms of how significant they are, whether they are presented as not very significant, or on the other hand, on the left, whether they're presented as more significant than they actually are, right? And the sense I have gotten, and I think that Sasha could probably kind of speak to this as well, is it appears that that the coverage we have not seen coverage on the part of those who would traditionally underplay the significance of this kind of as the man at the barricade called it, this kind of revolution. And on the other hand, it appears that we are seeing the kind of traditional left-wing over-exaggeration of the significance of these kinds of quote-unquote revolution, right? So I'm wondering if Sasha could speak to this. How can we guarantee? Because I don't know enough about this, but I do know that right-wing to centrist media in the UK has a tendency to underplay the significance of these kinds of movements, and left-wing media has a tendency to overplay the significance of these kinds of movements. How do you see that shaping up in this case?
An interesting one in this case, because I don't think the left or the right have particularly picked up this news story. We had a few articles. I mean, we had this Jacobin article that came out, but I didn't see a lot happening. And quite honestly, if I probably wouldn't have come to it if it wasn't for the fact that my mum is an organizer in Southeast, trade union organizer in Southeast Asia, and she kind of was talking about it a lot. And she is up at like 2 o'clock in the morning because of the time difference, organizing women workers and garment workers out in India and Sri Lanka and Southeast Asia. And so that's how I get my information. And the movement is big and it's growing. I definitely do think that it's significant. And I think the left actually need to make a lot more of it. We don't do enough international solidarity on the left. We don't do enough of really learning from movements in the global south. We do potentially have a little bit of exceptionalism within ourselves that we need to look at